All right, I'm just going to leave that there. Good evening, everyone. My name is Dean. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety day is July 30th, 2022. My home group is Rock Bottom Beginners, and I have a sponsor. His name is Taylor S. This is a reading from Chapter 5, How It Works of the Big Book, Alcoholics Anonymous, page 62. So our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. They arise out of ourselves, and the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he usually doesn't think so. Above everything, we alcoholics must be rid of this selfishness. We must, or it kills us. God makes that possible. And there often seems no way of entirely getting rid of self without his aid. Many of us had moral and philosophical convictions galore, but we could not live up to them even though we would have liked to. Neither could we reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. We had to have God's help. And on that, I have the pleasure of introducing Bob D., speaking on Step 4.
I'm Bob Stone, alcoholic. Having a really good time here. I want to thank my gorgeous wife for coming with me, and she's my rock sometimes. She actually likes to travel with me, which is very unique. And Henry, I want to thank you for your talk. Great talk. And Chris is there. They're building a statue of Chris at the General Service Office in the Host Hall of Fame. And Dean drove me in a rainstorm from the Philadelphia airport here and got me closer to God. So, what I'm tasked to do is to talk about what I've found to be the most overlooked, the most sloughed over, and yet, in my experience, the most vital and transformational part of the whole fourth step is in a little often missed part at the bottom of page 66, the top of page 67. But in order to talk about that, I have to talk about it in the context of where it lands in the first section of the inventory, in the resentment section. So the book asked me to do, if you really follow the book and the directions, it's asking me to do 6 things in the resentment section alone. What are those 6 things? Well, the first thing, it says, towards the bottom of page 64, it says, we listed people, institutions, or principles with whom we're angry. And that corresponds to the column on the left on page 65 where it says, I'm resentful at. And then it's names. So this is the who column for the most part. Then the second thing, it says we asked ourselves why we were angry. Middle column, page 65, the cause, the why. So we got the who, we got the why, and then the third column, it says at the bottom, we found that it was our self-esteem, our pocketbook, our ambitions. And the word if you change the word "our" to the word "my," it really corresponds to what it said earlier about we're looking for the manifestations of self, which had defeated us. So we're looking for, is it my self-esteem? Was it my pocketbook? Was it my ambitions? Was it my personal relationships, including sexual hurt, threatened? And if you go down the column on the left, the effects, towards the bottom, very strong one, pride. We had an old-timer in Vegas who died 50 years, many years ago, and he used to say, yeah, there's 7 deadly sins. Pride, lust, and 5 others. So we get these 3 columns. And then the book spends all of page 66 trying to sell me an idea. Really get it. I mean, really, can I really get what it's talking about here? That this stuff is poison. These resentments are poison. Infinitely grave. They shut you off from the sunlight of the Spirit. The insanity of alcohol returned, and you'll drink again. And to drink for us is to die. If we were to live, we had to be free of these things. And then it says something very interesting. It says, there must be 3 of these. They must be mastered, but you can't wish them away any more than alcohol. Wow. Then why are you telling me? It's a bad deal. They say, better get rid of this or it's going to kill you. Oh, by the way, you can't. What? What are you telling me for? So what do? And the next line says, this was our course. And if you look through this and you look through this and look through this, it's really the only course that gives you to get free of these things. The problem that guys like me have is it's so easy. I've talked to guys that are 35, 40 years sober that ask me for help, and they've missed this. So they're 35 or 40 years sober, and they're still uptight. They're still locked into that pissed off position. They've never forgiven any of these people from their childhood, even going back forever. Nothing's changed. And so they still suffer from their alcoholism, which is manifested, I think, it's part of my ego. And so, all right, I got these first 3 columns. So, what did I put down here? I think I've just been tricked into listing all my judgments and all my opinions about people. They don't tell you that. They call it resentments because we like that. I don't want. If you told me to list my judgments, I don't. I'm a tolerant guy. I listed all my judgments. And that's what the ego does the most. It judges. It plays God. Earlier in the 3rd step, it says, first of all, we had to quit playing God. How do I play God? I climb up onto the throne of judgment, and I trash you. I trash you. As if I can pull you down enough, I will rise up. I defend myself from low self-esteem with something that is defective. It doesn't work. And that's to tear you down, hoping that I will rise up. Or that at least if I find enough stuff wrong with everybody, it'll level the playing field. And all it ever did was make me more depressed and more lonely. And here's a crazy thing. The more judgmental I am of others, the more depressed I am. Because when you unleash the dogs of judgment, they always turn on the master. And so I may be putting you down all day long, noticing what's wrong with you all day long. And then at night, then now I'm the piece of crap. I'm the failure. I'm the guy, there's something wrong with me. And so my depressiveness, my anxiety, all kind of come back into this through this thing that the ego does the most. It judges. It plays God. And so I got these first 3 columns. And then this page 66 is trying to tell me something. It gets to the bottom. It says, this was our course. After it tells me I have to be free of this, and then I can't wish it away any more than alcohol. What do? It says, this was our course. And it's presenting me with a 2-part realization. Now, if you go back to step 1, the way it talks about it, not on the wall, but in the big book, in chapter 3, it says, we learned we had to fully concede to our innermost self that we were alcoholics. This is the first step in recovery. My grand sponsor, Chuck, used to say that recovery from alcoholism was an inside job. It's not a cognizant thing. it's heart knowledge. It's right in here. There's something inside of me that has to get stuff get it. And so it's going to enter me into a two-part realization. And a realization is not, can you see it intellectually? It's making something real inside you. And so the first part of the realization is not that difficult. It says we realized that the people who wronged us were perhaps spiritually sick. Yes, they were. And they were stupid, too, Let's put them out. Where's Dr. Kevorkian? Let's put them out of their misery. Sick bastards. Let's get out. Well, if that was all there was to it, I wouldn't get any better. I'd actually reinforce my egotistical judgment of them. Because my ego will get on board with this. Yeah, they're sick. Because my ego likes anything where I'm up here and you're down there. Right? Where I can feel, as the term that Wilson uses in the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, smugly superior. But now that it's tricked me into realizing and really getting that these people are sick, then it starts to walk me through a transformation. It says, even though I did not like their symptoms. Well, what's that? You mean that the reason I put them on the list, the causes, the middle column, that those are actually, those little bullet points that I put down there for why I'm mad at them, why I think someone should kill them, those are really their symptoms of their spiritual sickness. Well, could that be true? Well, let's look at it a different way. I hurt a lot of people. Honest to God, I didn't mean to hurt any of them, but I hurt them just the same. Driven by sickness, by selfishness, by fear, by abuse, by hurt, because hurt people will hurt people. By this vacuum inside of me that just drives me to take more, get more. Take yours. I'm driven by this stuff. And it's all part of my spiritual sickness. When I finally did my first really good 8-step list of people I'd harmed, honest to God, there was not one person on there I set out intentionally to harm. But I did harm people. And I harmed them because I'm asleep in my own life. My ego has seduced me into this bob land where I don't even see what I'm doing half the time. I step on the toes of people. I don't even know I'm doing it sometimes. All I can see is what I need and what I want to protect and what I got to get. And so, even though I don't like these people's symptoms, so all the little bullet points I put in the middle column, those are the symptoms of their spiritual sickness. So in other words, if they weren't spiritually sick, they wouldn't have done what they did that put them on the list to begin with, and there wouldn't be a problem here with that person. So it says, even though I did not like their symptoms and the way these symptoms disturbed me in the third column, my pride, my pocketbook, my ambitions, my relationships, even though I don't like their symptoms, and the way these symptoms have disturbed me, and then here's the kicker. It's asking me to realize, considering all this, that the people on my list, like myself, were sick too. This is not the position of a well person looking down on a sick person. This is the position of someone who's honest enough and humble enough to look square across the table at another person that's exactly like them. To get honest enough with myself, to know that if I had everything going on in me that was going on in you when you did what you did, that I am very capable of doing to someone else what you've done to me. That I'm not smugly superior. I'm not morally, I don't have the high ground and you have the low ground. that what's happened is I'm starting to, for the first time in my life, wake up to the truth about the people around me. You know, I think what Alcoholics Anonymous is trying to get me to do is to have God consciousness. Now, God consciousness is more than a consciousness of God. It's a consciousness of seeing God's kids the way God sees them. See, God sees your backstory. He sees the abuse that happened in your childhood that hurt you, that has driven you in your adult life to hurt people. He sees the vacancy and the fear and the tremendous feelings of inadequacy that sometimes drive you to step on the toes of other people. He sees the backstory. I don't see the backstory. My ego just wants me to see enough of the story, the front part, so I can judge you and feel superior. But God sees the whole story. And they're asking me to start to see the backstory. And I'll tell you, it's a game changer. When I was able to start doing that, man, when I looked, you know, my mother and father, with the vision I have today and the perception I have today, my mother and father loved me. My mother and father spent a fortune on therapists, bail bondsmen, lawyers, fines. My mother and father sacrificed more for me than any human beings could ever. They always loved me. They never hurt me. They never abused me, nothing. And yet, when it drove them insane of years of this, and they got to the place where they just threw up their hands and they surrendered, and we're not going to help you anymore. We're done. Don't call us. We're not going to come and bail you out of jail. And they didn't. From the moment they stopped supporting me and giving me what I want, because alcoholic ego hates to be thwarted. And from the moment they thwarted me, I found a way mentally, and this is crazy, where I made all the crap in my life their fault. And I made it in such a way that it made sense to me. Dr. Silkworth, in the doctor's opinion, says after a time, we can't differentiate the true from the false. Our alcoholic life seems the only normal one. Which means, what's this? That means I can take nonsense and make it make sense to me. My parents never did anything to me except try to help me. And I made it their fault. When I put myself in their shoes and I looked at me through their eyes, oh my God. It was embarrassing. I was a kid from hell. It was embarrassing. I was so selfish and so obsessively self-concerned. When I look back at my childhood, the only thing I remember with any clarity is me. You know, that's how self-centered I was. Even back then, I was just me. I can't tell you what difficulties my parents had, unless it had to do with me. I was that wrapped up in me, even back then. And the book, and it starts, before we even get into this was our course, it says something that is really good. It really helped me to get a picture in my mind of what I'm trying to do here, and this was our course. It says we were prepared to look at these judgments, these resentments, from an entirely different angle. So I have been looking at them, and when I tell you to make a list of your resentments, we got all that stuff on file. I could tell you about resentments I had towards my second grade teacher. I got it all on file. I never forget that stuff. Matter of fact, do you ever notice how resentments are so infinite? You could be 30 years, you haven't seen the person for 30 years, but when they hurt you, you freeze-framed them right there. 30 years later, they're the same SOB they were. Now, that's impossible. Life will change you. Life and time not only heals all wounds, it wounds all heals. Life will have a way of rubbing the sharp edges off your personality and break you. Your defects will break you in time. or you'll find a way to live with them. And maybe it's because you heavily medicate yourself. Or maybe you drink. Or maybe you gamble. Or maybe you do all kinds of things to divert you from you. But the idea that 30 years later the person's the exact same person is ludicrous. Are you the exact same person you were 30 years ago? Nobody is. So I freeze frame these people. And then years later, and then if you still see them from time to time, do you ever notice this? Once you have a resentment, you watch that person. And they can't do anything right. Isn't that amazing? Isn't that how could that be? Because your ego, my ego, needs to put another page in their case file. And I got to find more stuff wrong with you. Because my ego just wants to be right about you. It doesn't care if I can't sleep. It doesn't care if I take it out on other people. It doesn't care if it's ruined me in jobs, in workplaces, if I can't be around authority because I'm mad at authority figures. It doesn't care as long as I'm right. I think my ego doesn't care if it even kills me, as long as after I'm dead, people are walking around going, yeah, that Bob was right. He was right. So, look at it from an entirely different angle. Well, instead of looking at it from the position of a prosecuting attorney, we've got the first three columns. You've got the perpetrator, you've got the heinous acts, and you got the damage done. Well, so they were asking me to get up off the prosecutor's table in the courtroom and walk across and sit down on the defense table and start looking at it through their eyes. And I'll tell you something you can bet. Doesn't matter the circumstances, it doesn't matter the resentment. If the person you hate were to hit a bottom and they were ending up in some 12-step program and they got their first sponsor and they were trying to the best of their ability, to be honest, doing a fourth step, and they put your name in the resentment column, what would they put next to your name? What would be the story they would tell, that they tell themselves and tell anybody that will listen to them about what happened between you and them? And I know one thing for sure. The story they tell, it's different than the one you've been telling yourself. So I think sometimes the steps are designed to bring me back to reality, to bring me back to the truth, to bring me back to a consciousness that is different than the consciousness I got and the perception that I got sober with. To see things from an entirely different angle. And hopefully to see it like God sees it. So, and this was our course, they're asking me to put myself in the shoes, in the place of the person that I've judged so harshly until I really, in my innermost self, get it. What it must have been like on your side of the street in this situation that I hate you for. What was it like to be you? And I'll tell you, I did that I went through my whole resentment list, and I started doing that, and it was a game changer for me. Especially, well, I mean, it was all a game changer, but when I remember how harshly I judged my parents and how harshly I judged my exes and the bosses that had fired me. On and on and on. I was just a judgmental guy. I never knew it because when you think you're right, you don't think you're judgmental. I'm just right. And I went back through all these things and I started looking at it from their side of the street, and I remember thinking, God, how wrong I was about my father. And my ego got a little smaller. How wrong I was about my mother, and it notched down a little bit more. How wrong I was about my sister, my exes, my bosses, the police, the friends who I thought had turned on me. When I looked at it from their side of the street, I'm the guy who did it. There's a promise earlier in the book. It says that it talks about we're driven. We're people that are driven by 100 forms of fear, self-delusion, self-seeking, and self-pity. And driven by these things, what happens? Well, it says, Bob, you've stepped on the toes of your fellows. And what happened? And they retaliated. Of course they did. Of course they did. But we will invariably find that at some time in the past, Bob, you've made decisions based on self and what I want and the fears that drive me and my inadequacies. You made decisions based on self that, Bob, put you right there in that position to be hurt. And then it goes on to say, so our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. My sponsor, Clancy, used to talk about this being a disease of perception. And so when it says we're prepared to look at these from an entirely different angle, the hope that has prepared us for this is that maybe, hopefully, we're surrendered enough by this point that we're willing to be wrong. Are you willing to be wrong? And if you're not willing to be wrong, if you can't be wrong, I'm telling you, you're going to have a hard time in AA. Because we grow by our willingness to be wrong. We don't grow by being right, because if that was true, any degree somewhere in our literature it said when we were right, we promptly admitted it. It doesn't say that. It's when we were wrong, we promptly admitted it. And because as Harry Tiebout says, we must have ego reduction at depth. And every time I'm wrong, it's like a notching down of the ego. I was wrong. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about her. I was wrong. I was wrong. And no wonder it's not until the fifth step promises that we start to have a spiritual experience. There's too much of Bob in the way here. But I've notched me down enough that some lights start to come in. And maybe some love. And maybe even some compassion. Because when you can really put yourself in the shoes of someone you hated and judged intensely, and you see that's me. That's me maybe with a little more painful childhood. Or that's me with maybe a little bit more fear. But if I had, it's me. That guy's me. And for some of us, it's the first time for me that I ever started developing a little compassion. Compassion for my mother and father and my exes and the bosses that fired me. And compassion comes from two Latin words, cum meaning with, and passio is the root word for pain. When you have compassion, you have been given, through grace, the ability to sit with someone's pain. In other words, I get you. I see you. You're me. You're me on a bad day, maybe, but you're me. You're me. Maybe you're me with a worse childhood, but you're me. And I start to develop this compassion, and out of that starts to come a yearning for unity. I remember thinking about, I felt so horribly embarrassed and ashamed of myself that I judged my mother and father so harshly. And when I looked at it from their side of the street and I started waking up to the truth, I thought I had just developed this amazing level of compassion for what I put them through. And, and not only how I hurt them, they sacrificed incredibly for me. And I never even thanked them. That's how selfish I am. That's how much ego entitlement I have. I never even thanked them. And what had happened to me is a world, when I got sober, man, I did not do well sober, and the world was hostile, and it was unfair, and it was unjust, and people turned on me, and nobody really understood, etc., etc. No tolerance, just bad world. I do this, and you know what was sad to see? That the bosses I thought were unreasonable and hostile, they were actually more tolerant and more forgiving with me than I would have been with them if the tables were turned. Why did they give me the second chance? And the girls that I tried to date or be with, that eventually dumped me, when I put myself in their shoes, oh my God, I was so, it was horrible. How did they stay with me as long as they did? And what I started waking up to was the world was a very tolerable, very forgiving, very accepting place. The only person that wasn't was me. Because if the tables were turned, they were nicer to me than I would have been to them. I wouldn't have given them a second chance. I was too selfish. I was too vindictive. I was too retaliatory. And it's how wrong can you be? How wrong can a guy like me be? I'll tell you a quick little story. This is probably 30 some years ago. Maybe 30, no, not 35, but over 30 years ago. I was sponsoring a guy, and he had a bad childhood. His dad was not only a terrible alcoholic, but he was also very violent, and he raged a lot. And this kid's childhood was like a bad episode of Criminal Minds. His dad would just go into these rages and beat this little kid mercilessly. Kid would end up in the hospital many times. But it was back in the day that hospital emergency rooms weren't looking for child abuse. If you came in there and you had a broken arm, they'd patch you up and let you go. And especially if you told them you had a story like I wrecked my bike or I fell out of a treehouse, they just patched you up and let you go. And this kid was in the hospital a lot. He was beaten up a lot. And he lived that way. It was a childhood from hell. And when he got to be, as soon as he was old enough, he got out of there. And he was tormented by this resentment towards his dad. It affected his ability to have relationships. It affected his ability to even work for people. He had to have his own business because he couldn't stand being told what to do. He couldn't stand every authority figure, whether it was a boss, a cop, whatever, just brought back feelings about his dad. This resentment owned him. And he went to therapy. He tried the Gestalt chair, where you imagine your dad sitting in the chair and you yell at your dad, and then you go sit in the chair to be your dad. And he did that, beat pillows, did all that stuff. And none of it ever helped. All he ever got from therapy was he got some vindication that he was right and his dad was an animal. But it never touched the resentment. And all these decades later, he's in Alcoholics Anonymous, and we're doing a fifth step. He starts talking about his dad. And it was bad. And I said to him, I read a little passage to him out of the 10th step, where Bill expands on the principle of this was our course. And then I went back to this was our course, and I said to him, listen, you've got to realize how your dad's perhaps sick like you are. And when he heard me imply that he was like his dad, he flipped out. And he started ranting and raving. All this venom's coming out of this guy. He is not like my dad. My dad, he's cussing. And if you ever been around somebody that pops their cork like that, it's a little frightening. It's like, ooh. I'm just sitting there. I don't know what to say. all I can think of is, I guess he's not prepared to look at this from an entirely different angle, I guess. I don't know. I don't know what to think. Except this is not going well. So I didn't know what to do. So I just said, go to the next resentment. He starts reading the next resentment. And I'm sitting there, and as he's reading it, I'm not even hearing him because something's cooking inside of me. And I stopped him, and I said, I want to go back to one of the previous resentments. At first he thought it was his dad. And I said, no. Back in the beginning, that woman that you had that bad resentment towards because you lived with her for a number of years and she eventually threw you out, right? And he said, yeah. I said, there were kids? There were kids there? He said, yeah, what of it? I said, listen, I just wondered if there was any time when you were on drugs or drunk or hung over that you might have ever done anything to hurt those kids. And he hung his head down, and I don't know what's going on with him. And after a little while, he lifts his head up. He's got a tear coming down one side of his face. And I remember this whisper. It was such a choked, what he said next, he said it in such a pained and choked whisper, as if it was coming from the pit of some kind of hell inside of him. And he said, I guess I'm just like my goddamn father. I said, how did you feel about yourself when you hurt those kids? He said, I couldn't stay drunk enough. I said, you think your dad might be like that? He said, I don't know. I haven't talked to my dad in years. I have nothing to do with him. But my sister tells me that he's been forced to quit drinking because of pancreas and liver, and he's the most miserable, unhappy person she's ever known, depressed. And we started talking this through, and we're not talking about how his dad wasn't wrong. We're talking about how his dad was wrong, like he's capable of being wrong. And at one point, he said to me, I guess my dad is a vision of my future without AA. And he went to make amends to his father. And his father was living down in California in one of those trailer parks out in the middle of nowhere where you end up living if you've had a bad life. I mean, it's some kind of climactic place. It was horrible. And he went down to see his dad, and his sister had been telling him about his dad. And it was the first time he'd seen his dad in many years, and he called me up from a payphone. It was before cell phones. Called me up from a payphone outside the trailer park. And he was scared. I don't even think he knew why he was scared, but he was scared. And what it came out later, what we talked about, is he was afraid that when he knocked on that trailer door, that this monster was going to answer the door. And he knocked on that trailer door, and what answered the door was not a monster. It was a little old man who had tremors, and his head shook a little bit, and his hands shook a little bit, and he was depressed, and he was scared. And he looked in his dad's eyes, and he told me later, he said, I think I saw myself when I looked in my father's eyes. And he walked in there, and he started making amends. And what did he make amends for? Well, the last thing after the prayer, there's a last thing after the prayer that we were asked to do, is the book says, putting out of our minds the wrongs they had done, we resolutely look for our own mistakes, disregarding the other person involved entirely. So you can't use what they did to cover up and hide and keep in the shadows what you did. This is like, what if it's as if what they did is none of your business? They were perfect. Let's pretend they're perfect. But where were you selfish? Where were you a rotten son? Where were you at fault? And what he realized is he used his dad's violence and his dad's sickness to justify for a lot of years borrowing thousands and thousands of dollars from his father and never paying it back because his dad's an animal. And he felt vindicated, as if two wrongs make a right. Right? He gossiped about his father. He got a lot of people, friends of the family, and some of the other family, except for the sister, to turn against his father, because he would get other people to hate. He would exaggerate the stuff that happened. Some of it didn't even have to be exaggerated. He'd get people to hate his dad. And when he made the amends to his dad blew his dad's mind, and the dam broke. And his dad started doing something that he could not have done if the son hadn't have done what the son had done. He started crying and confessing how sorry he was for being such a terrible father. Sandy Beach used to say, the person with the tools gets to do the work. His father would never have had the tools to make amends to the son. And yet, His dad needed to make amends to him just more maybe than he needed to make amends to his dad. But if it wouldn't have been for what the kid did, he couldn't have done it. And I heard him share this before he moved to Texas. In an AA meeting, he said the greatest gift Alcoholics Anonymous had given him besides his sobriety was he got his daddy back. And he spent the rest of his father's life taking the money that his dad had loaned him and using that to take care of his dad. And they actually became very close. The things they had in common were so much greater than the few things that were different. But he never knew that. He never knew how much alike him and his dad were. How they both suffered from alcoholism. His dad didn't want to have alcoholism any more than the son wanted to have alcoholism. It's a horrible sickness. In our book, it compares it to that we're like a tornado going through the lives of others. You know, I've known a lot of people that have died of alcoholism, that have been in and out of AA for years, and they never buy the whole package. And we don't die well. Usually most of us, by the time we take our own lives, or we die by drinking ourselves into a coma, throwing up and asphyxiating or drowning in our own vomit, or however, we get shot, we say the wrong thing to the wrong person, or whatever, or we run our car into a bridge abutment at 90 miles an hour. It doesn't matter the methodology of our death, but what seems to be consistent is that when we die, everybody that we ever loved and wanted their approval wants nothing to do with us anymore. When we die in abject depression and loneliness and hopelessness. I don't think there is a worse way to die than from alcoholism, because we die from the inside first. Now, there may be some ways you can die that are physically more painful, but I'll take physical pain over that pain inside, the anguish that you can't escape. And I don't. And this guy was very lucky. He didn't die of alcoholism, and he's got, I think 6 kids and a wife. And my wife met his wife. We were down in Dallas 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago. Huh? Yeah, that's him. Right. Yeah, I told you that. And he's a free man today. And his memories of his dad are okay. They're good. When I had resentments, my memories of those people were horrid. Every time I know I'm not the only one this has happened to. If you have a bad resentment, every time that person's name is mentioned, your light dims. Right? And you get a little sick inside. And I'm the guy, if you even mention their name, I'll spend the next 2 hours having conversations with them in my head. Right? Right? I want to straighten them out, and I'll tell them this, and then, I'm that guy, right? I've become a hostage to my own judgments. And this is the beginning of the path to freedom. The path to... And here's another aspect of this that is surprising. I was a depressive. I've been diagnosed prior to sobriety, clinically depressed twice by psychiatrists, given treatment for that, medication, treatment for depression. But I wasn't really clinically depressed, I was spiritually depressed. I told my sponsor when I first got sober that I'm a depressive and I'm depressed. And he said, look at your life. You should be depressed, for God's sakes. If you weren't depressed, there'd be something wrong. And I mean, that's true. I was living in a Skid Row halfway house. I was afraid I was going to go to prison. I didn't have a job and couldn't have one for a long time. I was a mess. And he said, you should be depressed. And that is part of the territory for most of us when we get sober, that we're depressed. And a funny thing happened to me. As I started to take these people off the hook, it snuck up on me. And as I started to forgive and understand you, it came back on me. I started to forgive and understand myself. In the Lord's Prayer, which I think is one of the most dynamic prayers that we find in Alcoholics Anonymous, especially the pre-Christian version where the back half of it's just a little bit different. But in there it says, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. That implies a connected process. In other words, if you want to take yourself off the hook and stop beating yourself up for not being perfect, and you want to stop beating yourself up for your inadequacies, and stop beating yourself up for your emotions and everything else you beat yourself up for, you know how you can do that? You forgive them for those things, and it comes back on you. In Alcoholics Anonymous, we talk about this realm of the Spirit, and I believe this absolutely, that in the realm of the Spirit, you get what you give. And forgiveness is what you're going to give for these people that have hurt you, that you would hope that if you had hurt someone, they would give for you the same thing. That I give to you what I would want for me. I want everybody to understand me. I want everybody to take me off the hook. I want everybody to forgive me. But am I willing to do that for you? Because forgiveness is for the giving. It's not for the taking. Am I willing to do that? And this is where, I think for me, this was where for some of these people that I could sit in a therapist's office and beat pillows for weeks and it wouldn't have changed how I felt about it. But when I changed my consciousness and my perception of them, and I started to see it from an entirely different angle, it was a game changer for me. And if you would ask me, this was when I did this particular fourth step, I was 4 years sober. And I had done a couple fourth steps prior to that because we didn't know any better. Back in the 70s, there was no big book consciousness. We all wrote our life stories, you know. And I was honest with mine. I wrote all my secret, slimy stuff I didn't want anybody to know about. Take to the grave stuff. It was all down there, but it wasn't that much of a game changer for me. I came back later, and I wrote a fourth step, answering the 30-some questions in the book, the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions, and wrote about most of a page on each of the 7 deadly sins. Interesting exercise. But not really a game changer. When I did this out of the big book, it changed everything. Those other 2 fourth steps, after I did the 5th, if you would ask me, so what's the nature of the wrongs, Bob? I don't know. I stabbed a guy, and I lied a lot, and I had sex with someone I wouldn't want you to know I had lunch with. I mean, I hurt my parents a lot. You know, I would say it would be an immoral inventory. You asked me after I did the one in the book, I said I was so wrong about my mother and father and sister and girlfriends and bosses. I was just so wrong. And it's good being wrong. I know the ego hates it. But it's good being wrong, because in being wrong is freedom. Freedom from what? The bondage of self. Thanks for listening.